In this video, we're going to create an inventory tracking system in Sheets using app script. So what you see here is a preview of what we're going to create today. On this first tab called Add and Deploy, I have a drop-down menu where I can select different inventory items. I can key in either purchase information or deployment information to either add a new purchase or put some existing inventory into production, and these buttons here will do one or the other. And on the second tab, either a new purchase will be added to the bottom of this list, or if I want to deploy inventory, it's going to go find that inventory ID, find the first line item for that matching ID that still has enough quantity in stock, update these columns here for amount deployed and remaining quantity in stock, and if it needs more from a second or third line, it's going to find the next matching item and get what else it needs, and it's going to update these deployment dates and amounts over here. So I'll show you a preview. First, we'll just add a new purchase item. So when I click add purchase, we should see that purchased item get added down here in row 15. So there is that. Now we'll deploy 4,000 units of Fuji apples, and you can see this already had a previous deployment, so we should take 2,000 here and another 2,000 from here. And there is that. This gets updated. This is now 0. We took 2,000 from here, and now the new remaining amount is 3,000. And you can see if there was an existing deployment, it's just going to tack on that new deployment date to the end of the existing value, and the same for the amount deployed. What this also does back on the first tab is it shows the quantity of in-stock inventory for whatever is selected here, along with the weighted average cost per unit, the total value, and the same thing down here for used inventory. So before we get to the script part, I want to briefly run through these formulas here. So the first one is the quantity in stock. So that is just a simple sum if formula where the criteria range is column A on our transaction history sheet, which is the inventory ID column. The criteria, the second input for this criteria column, is cell D2, which is whatever inventory ID number is selected here on this drop down. And then we have our sum range, which is column G on the transaction history, which is our quantity in stock column. Then we have our weighted average cost per unit. So here we have the sum product function, and we have a criteria for this sum product. So to do that, we have inside parentheses just our criteria column, which again is column A, containing the inventory ID on the transaction sheet. Our criteria is again this cell here, containing the inventory ID that we selected. Then in our second argument, we have column D on the transaction history, which is the cost per unit. That is the thing we want to get the average for. Then we have, for our third input, column G on the transaction history, which is quantity in stock. That is our weight. So what that does is anytime there's a match on the ID, it multiplies each line item, cost per unit, times the quantity in stock, and then sums up all of those products So we have a total sum product, and then we're going to divide this output of the sum product by our weight, which is the quantity in the cell directly above it. So that gets us our weighted average cost per unit. We have this nested inside the if error function only because there could be a scenario where our total quantity in stock is 0 and you cannot divide by 0. That would cause an error. So that's why we have this if error. In the event there is a division by 0, we just want to place a 0 in the output if that happens. So that gets us our weighted average cost per unit, and then to get the total value, we just multiply the quantity times the weighted average cost per unit, and that gets us the total value for inventory in stock. We're doing essentially the same thing down here, only we're using the deployed, which is the used inventory column, instead of quantity in stock, because this is used inventory. So now we are ready to look at the add purchase script. Now, before we get to the script part, I just want to briefly point out that what this script is going to do is take the values in this range here, copy them, and convert them to a row, and then paste them over here on the transaction sheet. And I say that only because you want to make sure that your items are in the same order here as they are with the columns over here. So to get to the script editor window, we're going to go to extensions and then app script. Now I've already created the code to save time. I'm just going to quickly run through it. So we have a function called add new inventory. We have a variable called SS for spreadsheet that is equal to the spreadsheet application get active spreadsheet to get the one we're in now. We have 2 sheet variables for each of our sheets. One called sheet AD for add and deploy. That's our first sheet. That is equal to our spreadsheet application and get sheet by name and the name of that sheet. Same deal for our transaction sheet. So then we have a variable called range to add. That is equal to our first sheet, add and deploy, get range D2 through D6, and get the values. So that just gets all of the values in this range here. And now one thing I want to point out, even though that's one column, it's still a 2-dimensional array. It is an array of 5 rows by 1 column. So now what we're going to do in these lines here is convert that column to a row. So we have a new variable called horizontal range. We're going to take this previous variable, range to add, and use the flat method. Now that doesn't necessarily convert it to a row, but it just converts it to a 1-dimensional array instead of a 2-dimensional array, and it's kind of like a row. It's really like just a 1-dimensional row of 5 columns. And what we're going to do with that 1-dimensional array is reference it and then use the push method, because what we also need to do is input values in these columns here. And we really already know what these values are going to be. This is the script to add new records, and at this point the deployed or used amount is going to be 0 always, and the quantity in stock is going to be the same as the original quantity. So we're going to first add 0 to the end of this array with the push, and then we're going to add item 4 of the horizontal range array variable. And item 4 is actually this last item because the count starts at 0. So the first element is 0. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. So now we have an array of 7 values, and then we create a variable called final range, and that is just going to be equal to our horizontal range but enclosed in a set of brackets to make it a two-dimensional array again. And now at this point, we can drop it into our second sheet. But we need to get the next available blank row. So I have this variable called last row. That is equal to our transaction sheet. We use get last row method. And this by itself is going to get the last row containing values. We want the next available row below that. So we're going to add 1 to that. And then on our transaction sheet, we're going to use the getRange method. We're going to reference column A because we want to paste this in columns A through G. So we have a range reference of A and then use a plus symbol to join it to our last row variable because that's the next available blank row. So right now that would be like A16. Use another plus symbol to join it to the rest of our range reference, which is a colon and column G, and then another plus symbol to join that to our last row, which right now is 16. So that's A16 through G16 is our range reference. We're going to set the values of that range to our final range variable, which is our array of 7 items that we copied from the first sheet. So once that's been done, we've added our new records. Back on our first sheet, we want to get the range D2 and also D4 through D9 and clear the content because we just want to clear it out for the next transaction. And this is actually a formula that depends on that. So when I delete that out, it goes away. So there's no need to clear out cell D3. So now we're going to look at the script to deploy our inventory. So I'm going to go back here, come down to the second function called deploy inventory. We have our spreadsheet variable like before. We have our 2 sheet variables like before. Now we have a range variable called deployment range, which is equal to our first sheet, add and deploy, get range D2 through D9, get the values of that range. So that's this range here. And really the only values we're going to extract from that range is 1, the inventory ID number in this first cell, 2, the deployment date and the deployment amount. So that is our next 3 variables. So we have one called inventory ID to deploy. That's going to be equal to that range variable we just created up here. And then we have a set of 2 brackets with numbers to extract the row and column that we want from this array. So again, the count starts at 0 for both rows and columns. So the row is row number 0 because the ID is in the first row. The second input is column 0 because we really have only one single column. So it's always going to be 0 for all of these. Then we have quantity to deploy, which that is going to be the last row in that range, again in our one and only column. Deployment date is the second to last row. So that's stored in that variable, and the same for these other 2. And then we have a variable called inventory left. And that is equal to our spreadsheet, our first sheet, get range D12, get value, which is this cell here, the quantity in stock based on whatever is selected here. Because what we're going to do next is test to make sure that the amount input to be deployed here is less than or equal to the quantity in stock, because we don't want our script to run if we input something that's greater than what we have in stock. So that takes us to this if statement here, which is doing just that. If the inventory left variable is less than the quantity to deploy, then what we want to do is spreadsheet. In the spreadsheet application, we want to access something called get UI. That means get user interface, because it allows an alert message method. So this will just display an alert and a custom message you can input here. I just put not enough inventory left. So otherwise, with this else, if that is not true, that we do have enough inventory in stock, we're going to execute the rest of this code. So I'll just show you real quick what this looks like. So if we try and deploy something where the inventory is more than what is in stock for this ID, we get this warning message, not enough inventory left, and nothing happens. So now we're going to look at the code we want to execute if there is enough inventory remaining. So that's going to be everything from this else statement on. And this closing bracket ends all the way down here. So that's all of our code. So we're going to create a variable called transaction data that is going to be equal to our transaction sheet, get range A2 through I, and get the values. So that is going to get all the values on the entire sheet beginning in row 2, store them in this array variable. So it's a 2-dimensional array of rows and columns. We're going to run a for loop that just repeats a series of steps beginning at a beginning point and ending point that you specify, because we want to go through each row of that 2D array one by one, find all the matching IDs that still have enough inventory, all while keeping account of what we've already used until we've deployed everything that we need to. So we have a counter variable called J that represents each row in this 2D array. Our beginning point is 0 because that's the first row. We then define how long we want this to run for. We want it to run so long as our row is less than the length of the transaction data, and the length of the transaction data is the number of rows it has. We then tell it how we want this counter to increment in. Plus plus means increment in increments of 1. Then we have some more variables down here. So we have one called inventory ID that is equal to our transaction data array variable, and we have a reference to the row and column. So whatever row we're currently on, which is the first row in the first iteration of this loop, and then the first column, column 0. So that's the ID column on the first row to begin with. So that stores that in a variable. We then have inventory quantity used, that is equal to our transaction data. Whatever row we're on, column 5, which is really column 6 because it starts at 0, so that's the deployed amount column. We then have inventory quantity remaining, that's the next column over, so that's the remaining column. We then have previously deployed dates, which that is the next column over to capture any previous deployed dates. And the same thing for the next column over, any previously deployed amounts, because we want to store those in a variable if there's some already there and add on to the end of them. So the next thing we have here is we have another if statement, and we want to test if the inventory ID for whatever row we're on is equal to the inventory ID that was on our first sheet to deploy, and the inventory quantity remaining of whatever row we're on is greater than 0. That means there's at least some there that we can use. We're going to create a variable called quantity deployed, and that uses math method with the min method and we're going to take the minimum value of the quantity to deploy and the inventory remaining, because we don't want to take more than what's remaining in that particular row. And that's going to be stored here. And then what we're going to do is update our deployed column and our remaining column. So for our deployed, we're going to take inventory quantity used, which was what was already there, plus what we just calculated as deployed. And then a similar thing for the next column over, we're going to take, for the remaining column, the previous amount remaining minus the quantity deployed. So now we have another series of if statements, and this is really to deal with columns H and I. And H is a little tricky because we're dealing with some dates here, and we're dealing with scenarios where we previously potentially have dates already there. So we have an if statement for our date column, deployed date column, if it is not equal to blank, and our previously deployed date, we want to convert it to a string and get the index of. That's really just to see the position of where a semicolon is found. And what this greater than 0 means is if it's greater than or equal to 0, that essentially means it's true. Like a -1 would mean it's false. So we're basically searching to see if a semicolon is already there, because we need to do a special kind of formatting. So we're going to set that same column equal to our previously deployed dates variable, and then use a plus symbol to join it to a semicolon, and then another plus symbol to join it to our current deployment date. This needs to be enclosed in utilities format date, because the format date will format this deployment date, and the required syntax is the session we're currently in to get the current time zone, and then a comma, and then our date format. It's just real particular about dates when you're trying to do this type of thing. So that's just, we need to format that date we're going to tack onto the end. Otherwise, it's going to put it in this really long format that's just going to look kind of out of place. So then we have an else if. So same deal, same column. This is the next scenario if it's not equal to nothing. And that same column, we're going to convert it to a string, and the index of this is not found. So this -1 means false, that this string, the position is not located in that string, would be a scenario like this, because that's just a single date, whereas this script sees as a string just because it's got that semicolon in the middle. So in that scenario, we have two dates that we're going to join by a semicolon, and we need to format both of those dates. So if that condition is met, we're going to set this equal to our previously deployed date, formatted that same way as we did previously up here, and then join it with a semicolon and format the new date. I guess the only difference is this date, since it has a semicolon in it already, it's either two or more dates already there. AppScript sees that as a string already, and it's really not needed to be formatted again, whereas this is just two dates by themselves. So then anything else is going to be a nothing in that field previously, so we can just set it equal to the current deployment date. And so we have a similar thing for the next column over, except we don't have to really worry about all the date formatting. So we have our last column is not equal to blank, meaning there was nothing there. I'm sorry, there was previously something there. Then what we want to do is set that column equal to the previously deployed amount, use a plus symbol to join it to a semicolon and another plus to join it to the quantity deployed, the current amount. Otherwise, there was nothing there before, and we just want to set that column equal to the quantity to deploy. Now here is where we actually update our sort of current count of quantity to deploy. So we have our quantity to deploy, which we started out with up here, which is from our first sheet, and we're gonna add a minus symbol here and then set that equal to quantity deployed, which is the variable we created up here. So that just subtracts the quantity to deploy amount from this amount, and that in turn just updates this amount to the new value, and then we have our current amount of what's left versus what we started out with from the first tab. And then we have an if statement here to check and see if the quantity to deploy, if it has reached 0, then we want to break out of this loop because we've met the deployment amount. If it hasn't, then it's just going to keep running back through this loop until it does. And down here we come to our sheet, transaction sheet, and we're going to get the range A2 through I, and we're going to set the values equal to our transaction data variable, because this is the point where we actually write what we've done here with the updated values to the sheet. So we're really just going to overwrite the existing sheet. And then finally, back on our original sheet, we're going to get the range D4 through D9 and clear the content out for the next transaction. Well, that is all for now. Thanks for watching.